Senator Bragg.
Much, Acting Deputy President. Well, I think the main point here is that the government is finding that governing is very difficult. And when you are the dog that has caught the car, it is a big problem for the country, because when you win an election with very few policies and you have people in positions that are not capable of administering departments and responding to events in a timely fashion, it is a very obvious problem now that the country has, because the consequence of these actions or these failures to act in a timely manner has meant that Australians have been unnecessarily exposed to violent criminals in our own society. And this was not a difficult thing to predict. In fact, 6 months ago or so, the High Court had flagged that there were issues here in relation to these laws, and the government should have been prepared. The government should have been prepared to act quickly with a bill, and we had the charade of a parliamentary sitting just 2 weeks ago where there was emergency legislation rushed in, which was amended the day after it was introduced following the recommendations of the opposition. Now, I welcome the fact that the government's been prepared to take advice from others, but you have to think that the best position here would be that the government could take advice from its own departments, direct them to be ready for events, and then have the legislation ready to go in the instance where the court makes a decision that exposes people to danger. And that's really what this is about. It's about, is the government competent and capable of protecting the Australian people in relation to these matters? Now, the legislation we now have, again, we are recommending improvements to this legislation because we want to make sure that it does do the job and it does protect the Australian people. Now, in relation to the various distractions that have plagued the government, that may be an excuse to a certain extent, but ultimately these are not events which were difficult to predict, as I said, and so we've now seen 80 or 90 people who were released into the community temporarily a couple of weeks back. They are now under some sort of supervision. But it is extraordinary to think that in this day and age, with the resources available to the government, that this could have happened. I mean, the government is hiring 10,000 new public servants here in Canberra. I mean, what are they all doing? The government wants to hire more politicians as well, we see. So there's not a problem with resourcing here. It's a problem of leadership and competence in these roles, and these ministers don't have to generate bills here they're not hugely complex bills. I mean, there are bills and there are bills, and we've seen in this parliament that there are vastly more complex concepts that have been attempted to be legislated across the economy, across our society, and these bills, while they may be heavy in legalese, are not the hardest bills to have ready to roll if they are needed in a contingency. And I think that the Australian people will be always wanting their governments to be successful in that they are able to promote policies and ideas that are going to improve the nation, send it in the right direction, and so on and so forth. And in this case, I think people will just be, bewildered that this has been handled in such a sloppy way, not by one minister, but by a handful of ministers here. And that's why we have this institution of a parliament, because our role here is to ensure that we hold the government to account, that we hold them to their commitments. That is an important part of our democracy. And in this case, I think that the coalition has played a constructive role, I should say, in recommending improvements to these various pieces of legislation, which should have been prepared some months ago. And I think that if you go through these cases, which have been canvassed by my colleagues in detail, there are people here who have committed very serious crimes against Australian citizens, and there is no excuse for any government to allow violent criminals to be exposed to Australian citizens. And there have been particularly harrowing stories where the victims of some of these crimes have had particular concerns that the perpetrators have been released into the community without any supervision or without any measures being in place. Now, this was, of course, a huge risk that the government created some weeks ago when they had failed to respond to these events in a timely manner. And I remember my good friend Senator Scarr canvassing some of these matters in his recent contributions in relation to some constituents in Queensland. And so ultimately we have put forward some recommendations here, some amendments to the government. We hope that the government will take these on board, as they did a couple of weeks ago. Look, it's not ideal to see the opposition legislating. It's much better for the government to legislate, much better for everyone. But as I say, we welcome the fact that the government has been prepared to look at these things with an open mind. But I guess the political point remains that we want the government to do a better job, because we want the Australian people to feel safe, and we don't want people to feel that they are going to be under threat from violent criminals who should be restrained and who should not be set onto our streets. That is a fundamental expectation the Australian people have, that those sort of people will not be exposed to the community, that they will be restrained in some form because they have committed and have been convicted of serious crimes. So the basic standard here is, if you've committed a crime, you should face serious consequences, and that if there is a legal quirk that occurs where serious criminals are released from custody or from other measures, they need to be dealt with as soon as possible, rather than this being dragged out for weeks and weeks without a proper resolution.
Senator Bragg. Senator